Hello everyone. My name is Nasser Rabbat. I'm the Kham Professor, Director of the program, and the convener of the lecture series. This semester we finally have a decent poster that we will be sharing, hopefully, with everyone. I just want to tell you about our next activities before we start with today's lecture. On the 7th of April, we have Rafat Majzoub and Nicholas Fayyad speaking about a book launch of the book that both of them are co-editors of, Beyond Ruins, Reimagining Modernism is the title. On the 14th of April, we have Dimas Rougi, architect, artist, and founder of Holoforms Studio, and she is going to speak on Palestinian heritage and architecture of liberation. And on the 28th of April, we have Aslahan Gunhan, who is our postdoc also this semester, like Rafat, and she will be speaking on making and making land, architecture, environment, and dispossession in the upper Euphrates. I hope to see many of you, as you did to our friend Mark today, to show up in the lecture. Normally I try to have very short introduction, but because I know this guy for the last 45 years, it's going to be a very long introduction. No, actually, no, not really that long. But Mark, first and foremost, is my closest friend and colleague at MIT. That, of course, actually doesn't add or subtract from his qualifications. I'm just sharing this with you. He's a professor of the history and theory of architecture at MIT. His work covers a wide range of topics, but his most wide-ranging and long-term achievement is his work on global architectural history, on which he published several books and articles. First was the groundbreaking textbook entitled A Global History of Architecture, with his long-term partner and co-author Vikram Prakash. He also wrote of Architecture of First Societies, A Global Perspective, which came out in 2013, which builds on the latest research in archaeological and anthropological knowledge, while at the same time challenging some of their received perspectives. His most recent book is Architecture Constructed, Notes on a Discipline, 2023, that studies the frictions between the architect and the contractor, positioning it within the problematic of Eurocentrism. Jarzombek also taught the first ever MOOC, Mass Open Online course on the history of architecture with thousands of participants worldwide here at MIT. He and Prakash won $3.5 million grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to create a new scholarly entity called Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative, GAHTC, promoting the development and exchange of teaching materials for architectural history education across the globe, in which many of us in this room have participated over the years. Jarzombek's and Prakash's other joint venture is the Office of Uncertainty Research, which is an independent post-tenure, I don't know why is it a post-tenure, I mean, at MIT, in the lingo of MIT, that means like you're too old and you're already retired and they gave you a post-tenure. Collaboration dedicated to challenging architecture's epistemological and design capacities and bringing the conversation back into a world of immersive ambiguities. Projects from OUR have been exhibited at international venues and now here at MIT. Is it still on?
Nope. It was happening yet, and that was it.
Oh, okay. You missed it. Some of us actually have gone there and enjoyed the interaction with a machine. Jarzombek's other publications include Digital Stockholm Syndrome in a Post-Ontological Age, Urban Heterology, Dresden and the Dialectics of Post-Traumatic History, and Krzysztof Wodishko, City of Refuge, a 9/11 memorial, which he edited with Machthild Wildrich. Jarzombek's awards are too numerous to list. He has organized several major international conferences and was the founding faculty editor of Thresholds, an annual peer-reviewed journal produced by the Department of Architecture. But Jarzombek's achievements are not limited to his scholarly work. He is a true polymath, or to use a more fitting term, a Renaissance man. After all, he wrote his Ph.D. dissertation on Alberti, which is probably his role model. He is a musical composer, a biographer of no other than his father and uncle, an artist with exhibits in local galleries, and a builder. His barn is a very beautiful techno-vernacular example for those of us who are lucky enough to visit his home. But above all, he's a curious person who is always taking up new ideas, investigating them, and making something out of them. My favorites are his organic sculptures, made of found and recycled objects, of which I am the proud owner of 3. His talk tonight is entitled Islam and the Global Luxury Commodity Trade in the 10th Century. He's actually challenging himself and going back further in time and in geography as well. I will read the abstract just to put everyone in the mood, or you want me to stop here? Stop? Okay, well then please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Jarzombek.
Thank you, Nasser, for the introduction, and we have time for the ability to talk to you here tonight.
It has to be blue. Yeah.
Oh, is it working? No? It is? Okay, good. The title is obviously Islamic trade, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about. But I introduced that concept with a certain amount of trepidation, because the type of trade I'm going to be talking about and the type of issues I'm talking about is sort of nominally Islamic, and we get into a bit of a nomenclatural spaghetti of where does Islamic trade begin and where does it end. So I'm using it here extremely loosely. I'm trying to avoid any particularly hard distinctions about it, because as soon as we start defining it, we actually wind up excluding things that were part of the trade system that we wouldn't be talking about. So, however, when we're in, this is in the Dubai Louvre, we can sort of see the classic understanding of the Islamic trade with these lines that go from here to there, or here we're in Sharjah Heritage Museum, and you can sort of see these lines that crisscross the globe, and then there's some points or dots and so forth. So this is the classic way in which these oceanic trade routes, is what I'm going to be talking about, are portrayed. So here we see Silk Road, roads up there, and we see the blue ones sort of down here, and we usually sort of accept that as, yep, okay, Islamic trade routes. Well, this map in particular, which, and this is, we see many maps like this, has come out of a book that was recently published, is sort of wrong on any number of accounts. So it calls it the Maritime Silk Road, and, well, maritime is certainly correct, but silk was not one of the major commodities moving in these lanes. And so, therefore, to give it a metaphoric abstraction of silk is, I would say, and actually wrong. Right? But yet, somehow, there's this idea of this magical place of Silk Road. But where's the silk, right? So why don't we calling it then other types of things, right? And then the other problem is, of course, and this is the issue I'm going to try to get to today, is you see it has a few dots here and there, and there's these sweeping lines across, as if it were already predicting sort of the modern container ship that's going from metropole to metropole, and maybe stopping somewhere along the way to pick up something or drop off something, right? In other words, all of this world down here basically is blank, right? There's like nothing really going on there, right, except maybe a port or two, right? And so basically it portrays the route as sort of long, tremendous journey across a lot of water, which it was, but that's only, if you will, let's say like 10% of the story. So the advantage of having an Islamic and organizing entities sort of in control of this trade route was huge. They did not invent these trade routes. The trade routes were there already, maybe 100 BC, 200 BC. Basically, it's like the 3M Corporation advertisement about 10 years ago. They say, we didn't invent Scotch tape, we made it better. And this is a little bit like that, right? They didn't invent these routes, but they sort of made them better and stronger and more resilient. So, and also, they brought with them technical knowledges that could now be distributed with them in different ways. So the Islamic part of it sort of simplified a lot of the negotiating that took place, because you had, 8 different languages, you had different this, different that, right? And now there is a sort of a one clean, sort of monotheistic world that helped the ship captain in Malaysia be sort of more or less on the same page with the ship captain in Africa, right? Now, of course, that's on paper, right? Who actually knows what happened, in the holes, but at least it helped smooth out many of the crinkles that were in this system. So here's another map, and here you can sort of see added by author, because this map basically gives the standard the view of Islam at the time as sort of a land civilization, and it doesn't put in the dots where Islamic traders had set up camp in some form or other, right? They had, their cousin was living here, their uncle was living there, They didn't just arrive to port and there's, nobody there. They arrived to these ports and there was already basically small communities that would be help negotiating with the locals about all sorts of things. But I really want to basically try to pixelate this a little bit. And so I've taken the liberty to sort of look at 3 particular commodities. So this is an ivory box from Spain, from Islamic Spain. And you open it up, and inside there's an inscription that says a few things. And then it says, "Beauty has invested in me with splendid raiment, which makes a display of jewels. I am a receptacle of musk, camphor, and ambergris." So I just simply ask a very stupid question. Where does this stuff come from? Right. Well, that's where we're going to be on this journey today about this material. So here we are in Damascus, and I'm in the shopping area, right? And you see this stuff, there's the musk, and there's the amber, and there's other things, right? And this picture, just like the box, right, is important to my story because these things are next to each other, right? And that's really a significant aspect of what I'm trying to sort of get across. Now, musk, as it turns out, was pretty well unknown until Islam made it into this incredible commodity. It was certainly circulating. Muhammad goes to pray. He puts musk into his beard, and then he prays. And then if you read the Quran, and you say, oh, Muhammad did this with musk in his beard. If I want to be a good Muslim, I'm going to have to put the musk in my beard. So basically, being a devout person of Islam, you wanted to do what Muhammad did, which was put musk in your beard and have the aroma of that. Well, the problem is, someone must have given the musk to Muhammad. It was a very expensive, unusual thing, right, at that time. So where did this musk come from, right? So here are some of the locations. And you see 9,000 kilometers away in the Himalayas are the famous deers that produce the musk. It's in the side, in their groin, a sac, and they use it to demarcate territory with the male deer. And so you got to go up to the Himalayas and you got to kill the musk and you chop it out and you put it in a bag and and you have your musk. So the location of where this happened is not necessarily what I'm trying to, however, talk about. Even though it is very far away, we have to first think a few basic things. First of all, we're not talking about anything that's coming from China. We're not talking about metropole to metropole. We're talking about something that goes from metropole to the mountains of the Himalayas. So we're talking about a vertical relationship of things going upstream and things going downstream. The musk is going down, figuratively downstream. And the irony was, people know so little about musk because it was really, what?
Stay close to the camera.
Oh, okay. Oh, camera?
No, I mean here, because this is how you are
Sorry,
being
okay,
captured.
okay. Right. But by the time we get to the 17th and 18th century, people become curious and like, what's going on up there with these deer and so forth like that. And slowly a bit of information comes to sort of leak out. Well, it turns out the musk deer can speak Tibetan, right? And so when the hunters are going up there to capture the deer and they're speaking Tibetan, the deer are going to go away. So the hunters have to speak a magical language to trick the deer into not running away. And so they've developed this magical language so that the deer are standing there and they can get to the deer. Now, you find sort of stories like this in like histories of pagan religion or stuff like that. Whereas for me, it's like, oh, there's sort of an economic incentive to keep the acquisition of musk as remote and as magical as possible as a way to form a type of epistemological barrier between the metropole people, who obviously want to do this faster and quicker, right, and the mountain people, right, who are deploying rituals as a way to sort of separate themselves from the traders down in the valley. So the musk then gets brought down to the next closest village, and then next down to the next closest village, and on down to various places. One of these places is in Vietnam called Indrapura, which means, Pura means city. It's an Indian word, and Indra means Indra, the god of the water, goddess of the water. And so it's the city of Indra, right? And that might first strike one as a little odd. We're in Vietnam. Why aren't they speaking Vietnamese? Well, this relationship now between the elites of Indrapura, right, and the mercantile elites of India was so strong that they wanted to be more like Hindu than Indians, right? So they completely adopted sort of Hindu lifestyle, Hindu names for their children and so forth. They intermarried with the traders that were coming up and so forth. And they sort of reproduced this hybrid animist Hindu world, right? So when we see this is white musk, which is artificially produced. Most today that you can buy is all artificially produced. It's not coming from the musk deer anymore. If it would cost you $5,000, and maybe you can afford it, but I certainly can't. And this is artificially produced. And here we are in a museum in Sharjah, and you can sort of see musk. But you can sort of see that right above the musk, there's this other thing called oud wood. Right? And part of what I'm going to try to say is that there were these interrelationships between these commodities that is really important. And so here it is. And I can pass these guys around. So this is the real stuff from Vietnam, very expensive. I mean, in the sense that might cost $15 each of these little pieces. And so the musk gets brought down, and then they go into Vietnam, to the highlands of Vietnam, and that's where agarwood is. Well, what is agarwood? What is this stuff? Well, it's not a tree. It basically is a tree of various types that are in the mountains of Cambodia, mostly, that get damaged by insects, and then the tree protects itself by hardening its core, right? So basically, you can sort of see here, there's a tree with that had been damaged, and that's the agarwood on the inside. So you do not know what agarwood on the outside is. You see a tree, it looks perfectly fine, and you cut it down, and it's just a plain old, tree, right? The next tree was the tree with agarwood. So the forest tribes who lived in Cambodia were able, by whatever mechanisms, we're not exactly sure, to tell the difference between one tree and another tree. The last thing you want to do is start to chop down all these trees and have nothing to show for yourself. So somehow they figured out where the agarwood is, because you can't see it on the outside. So once again, these are sort of specialized epistemologies of acquisition that are very unique to particular cultures, to particular tribes, to particular types of identities. Today they do this to the tree. They take the drill and they drill it, and the bugs come in, and then 10 years later you got agarwood. So if you go to the markets wherever you might want to go and you get agarwood, chances are it's this stuff from Indonesia or from the Philippines or sometimes now from India, where they sort of produce this sort of artificially. The real stuff coming from actually trees by some locals who know the difference, like this, is like a fortune. So why would you get it? Now, this stuff came to Baghdad because we know the inventories, and they came to the metropole in prodigious amounts. So you needed tons of musk, right? You needed tons of agarwood. And there were sort of two reasons for this. One was you wanted to use it, obviously, right? But you didn't want to use too much of it because you never know, right? But you wanted to use it. And the agarwood in particular was used in mosques. It was used outside of the city gates. We have lots of evidence for it, of how it was used as a way to have an olfactory semiotics of global reach. So it's not a perfume in the sense that we may think of, oh, I want to smell good. It was when you enter the city and go through those gates and they're burning agarwood, it's like saying, oh, that's you're burning money. Now, if I reach in my back pocket and I put out a $10 bill and I burnt it here, it wouldn't smell very good. But if I were like really rich, and I go, yeah, I can burn money. I mean, the metaphor of burning money, right, is literally what you're doing when you're burning agarwood, right? So it's not just the perfume. It's saying we are so wealthy we can just burn this stuff, right? It smells good, by the way. So which sort of comes first, a little bit the chicken or the egg, right? Yeah, it smells good, but it's also part of the semiotics of wealth from in the metropole. And of course, if you were a fancy rich person, you wanted to look like, act like, and smell like wealth. Right? Today, in our modern world, you can't do that. I wanted to ignite one of those bits and pieces that are floating around, but I was told in no uncertain terms this would be illegal and the police would be coming here and stopping this whole charade. So I decided not to do it. But I did leave this open a little bit so you can get a little waft of the smell. So there would have been no a ceremony in the Islamic world, no ritual, nothing in the mosque without the smell of agarwood. Right? So it was a way in which you could advertise these reaches, right? But the guys who are harvesting agarwood are not Islamic, right? So in other words, part of what we're you have to imagine, right, is that Islamic trade, the Islamic part of it feathers out, right, and it goes into these other worlds, but it is sucking this stuff up, right, into it. Now, one of the things about these two commodities in particular, but many of the commodities I'm going to be talking about today, is that they weigh practically nothing. Agarwood is, a bag of agarwood, right, on the guy's shoulder in the mountains of Vietnam is a millionaire. Right? He doesn't see himself as a millionaire. He doesn't need a yacht and he doesn't need fancy clothes, right? He does need something, and that's what I'm going to be talking about, right? But these, relationships of affluence to wealth, right, are drawn very, very close together, right? So, and he could carry it in a bag, right? So you didn't need superhighways. You didn't need carts with wheels on them. You didn't need big roads. You didn't need big infrastructure of transportation, right? All the things that you needed if you want to carry grain or porcelain or bronze or cotton. All these things are very heavy, and they needed infrastructure, and they needed to get to the dock, and they needed to be warehoused and so forth, right? The guys sort of show up and with a couple of bags of this stuff at the port, and you're ready to go, right? So the non-capacity or to invest in infrastructure. So when modernity comes along, they go, oh my God, you guys are so undeveloped. Well, that's because their affluence didn't need what we would assume to be a developmental structure of infrastructure, roads, and so forth, right? So the question I'm trying to ask is, like, what did they get? What did these mountain people get? They didn't do this just because they were nice, right? They're not going to go into the mountains and kill all these animals by the thousands, right? Dig the musk out and go, hey, yeah, you can have that. I don't know, They wanted something, right? Well, what? We don't know. So we have some good guesses, but they didn't write it down. And the guys in the Laos villages didn't write anything down. And the Champa didn't write anything down, right? So we don't really know. But we know from parallel universes, so to speak, roughly what they would have wanted. So they probably wanted rice because they can't grow rice. And rice was an incredible trade commodity. We think of it as food, but it was actually a holy commodity, right? You don't have Buddhism without rice, right? And so rice was seen as a spirit commodity as much as it was actually nutrition. They wanted marriage arrangements. They wanted to protect themselves from their neighbors who were going to steal the musk or steal the agarwood, right? So they wanted some protection. So they would have married the guys down in the valley and had some arrangements, in that way. They wanted prestige goods. So when the ritual day was around, they wanted to look good so that people knew, oh, that's the musk hunter. He's special, right, and so forth. And that could be clothing. It could be fancy foods. It could be, whatever you imagine, right? So none of this hits the archaeological record. It just disappears, right? So the further up we go, the larger the invisibility is of these arrangements in our historical record. Right. So we have to see where this is happening in other places to understand that the guys doing the musk and the agarwood were getting something, even though there's no archaeological record. And so that got me to thinking about how this upward flow, this invisibility, needs to be not necessarily say, I know what they wanted, but we have to define it as a separate economic reality. So I coined that dark matter economy. Dark matter comes out of physics. It's maybe not the best metaphor, the closest I could come. 80% of all matter in the universe is dark matter, but you don't see it right now. Zoom, zoom, zoom. We're all being zoomed around by this dark matter stuff because it doesn't affect gravity and so forth. I'm not exactly sure how to physicist. But there's a lot of it around, right? And without it, we wouldn't be here physically, right? We would be floating off somewhere, right? So dark matter is what keeps the universe in its gravitational field sort of in play, right? So that's what I'm saying. These upward flows of these economies are like the dark matter. Without them, it doesn't work, right? So what do they do with their wealth and with their status? Well, one is to have feasts and do things that maybe have no archaeological trace. But the Champa, they knew what to do. They said, bring us some special Hindu designers who are going to make some temples for us. And so they made these temples. And probably after a while, they knew how to make it themselves, and they didn't need the specialized instruction. But somewhere along the line, a boat shows up, and they say, okay, if you're Hindu, you have to have a Hindu temple, and this is what it's going to look like, and it has these geometry specificities, and we have to do it this way. And so they constructed a holy land around the Hindu paradigm that you have a sacred mountain, the Rooster Mountain. The Rooster Mountain, the rooster is seen as wealth-producing animal in Vietnamese folklore. So if you're wealthy, you want to be with the rooster, right? And then it has a river that comes out of it, which is the Ganges model, like the Ganges River, right? It's sort of the sacred river. And there's this water system that comes out of this sort of bowl. And here are the Rooster Mountains over here, another mountain over there. and the water comes out. Unfortunately, this gets us to another issue, the historiographic question, is that the study of the hydrology of all this is non-existent. People haven't studied yet the water history and the water imaginaries that go along with many of these sites. But basically, this is it. So Mysore is the name of the site. That's sort of the Ganges River. This is the Himalayas, right, in model form. You see this throughout India and other places where you sort of model the Holy Land. You need the mountain and the river, and Indrapura, the city of Indra, you know, it's like a done deal, right? So they produce, right, this small, mini, esoteric, Indian, Hindu special place, right, out of what was not there, right? You know, I mean, you could say the Ganges River goes back, you know, millions of years, right? This river too is very old, but at some moment, 200-300 AD, they start saying, oh, no, we can make a Holy Land here, right? And so they start making this Holy Land, right? And then it becomes, if you will, the mediating relationship between the traders coming up and the guys coming down from the forest, right? Now, for the Champa, the beautiful part of this arrangement is that they had to do almost nothing. The guys came down from the forest with the musk and the agarwood, right? The traders, they were not traders. The traders come along. Some were then Islamic, some were Malay, some were Arab, no Chinese yet at the time. And they were just passing by, you know, like this, and they would stop, and then they would say, okay, here's the stuff, right? So from the Champa point of view, this was, you know, like literally money from heaven, because they had to almost do nothing. All they had to do was take this stuff here, make a magical kingdom, you know, and enjoy the profits. So of course they could build this incredible building in the middle of nowhere practically, right? So that in the building itself becomes a type of trader's special, right? You know, it's like, oh my God, you know, you're a sea captain, you're traveling up the coast, and it's like, not do you want the agarwood, you want the tour of Mysore, right? You want to see this stuff. I mean, you've heard about it, you know, from other traders, how special this was, and how did they make this bricks? And bricks are not used with, there's no mortar. They're literally glued together with some sort of magical special glue. Even we today don't even know about it. So these buildings became like, you know, I don't know, conversation points among the traders, right? So what I'm trying to do is focus on this cross-territorial upstream, downstream, mountain metropole movements of luxury goods to talk about there's a different type of global that's at play here than just metropole to metropole. And we've got to take this vertical, and this is somewhat simplifying because it's not always literally upstream, downstream, but I'm sort of saying there's that relationship. All right, so these two things happen together, right? Now, in a normal architectural history course, you would never put Mysore and, you know, Baghdad, you know, together, but basically these guys were the supplier of musk and agarwood. They became wealthy overnight, practically, just doing this stuff, right? Building this amazing things, right? This is the classic metropole situation. You know, they need army, and they need buildings, and they need temples, and they need fortification, you know, they need all of that stuff. None of this stuff, you're not going to find any of that here, right? There's no walls, no fortifications, you know. They're friendly with the mountain people because they're giving them rice, and they're giving them feasts, and they're intermarrying, and they're friendly with the traders. The only people they had a problem with was the Chinese, who came down and wanted to invade them and steal some of their stuff, and then occasionally the Khmer said, oh my God, these guys, let's go invade too. So it wasn't that it was just always peaceful, but I'm saying their mindset wasn't around the metropole consciousness, right? It was sort of this forest-based world of interaction, and for better or worse. Now the thing is, when you're a trader and you come up to Indrapura, you can't just show up with an empty boat. You've got to have something, right? So you got to bring some goods to these guys, right? Otherwise, what's the point, right? So what did they want? Well, I've already told you what they wanted. They want a few other things, but I'm sort of simplifying it down for today and say one of the things that they want, who would not want it, is gold, right? Gold ornaments, gold bangles, gold jewelry, gold plates. You know, they don't have that in Vietnam. So they said, okay, show us some gold. Okay, so the trader's got to say, oh my God, I got to go get the gold first, obviously. Well, there's only one place in all of Southeast Asia where you could get gold, and that's in Borneo. So Borneo is like, that's a long way away. All right. So till today, you can get gold in panning it. The government is very worried about that, of course. And here they're sort of illegal and semi-legal gold farms. Now, the books like the Headhunters of Borneo, because in the 19th century, the English came, Americans came, and oh my God, these guys are really, scary people, headhunters, right? Well, the Punan tribe and other tribes were panning this gold, right, for the arriving traders. And what the English discovered, they were still panning the gold, that the guys in Borneo didn't want gold. They said, gold? Oh, what do I want gold for, right? You want some gold? Okay, I'll get you some gold, right? So they were confused because they would go up to the Punan guy and say, hey, what are you doing there? And sort of, we're panning for gold. and then you can sort of see, it appears they're miserable, poverty-stricken people, at least such of them as I've seen. And I've seen hundreds of them going along to Padang, half-starved, clad in rags, with perhaps $1,000 worth of gold thus concealed in their purses, right? And then they trade it. So the gold for the guys in Borneo was not seen as particularly special. Okay. Anyway, they're still looking for it now, and the guys are still trying to find the gold. So now the thing is, we think there's something called Java gold. All the Java gold, they're very famous. The Javanese were palace culture. They made these most incredible things. All this gold comes from Borneo. It's right across the strait. They travel for a couple hours across the water. They go to the Borneo people, say, hey, give us some of that gold. Thank you very much. They take the gold and they make this thing called Java gold, which is all from Borneo. So what we see is the gold is, here, right here, the Java guys go back and forth because these guys don't have any boats, right? And it's very close. They make the gold ornaments here or other places. I'm simplifying it. And then they bring it up closer to the trade routes, to a place called Barus, one of several areas where the boats are going to be coming by, right? Makes a lot of sense. And of course, the guys in Yogyakarta become, overnight, some of the richest people on the planet. Borobudur makes sense, right? Because now they too can take all this wealth from getting the gold and making gold ornaments and sending it up, right? All they had to do was, get across the water a little bit and to the harvesters. Which brings me to the second commodity here, which is camphor. I was going to bring some camphor today. It's made as mothballs. I was going to open it up and have it smell it, but it's a biohazard, and so don't worry, I'm not going to do that. But camphor, up until the modern age, was used in medicine. It was used in foods, and above all, it was an aphrodisiac. So if you were an up and mighty person in China or in India, you wanted as much camphor as possible to sprinkle around your bed, right? So all the elites in India and China, they just were like camphor-centric, right? The problem is camphor comes from one place, Borneo. We're at Borneo again. Right. Today's camphor, it comes from not really camphor anymore. First of all, it's made by machine, and if you get natural camphor, they take it from camphor-related species, and they don't do camphor balls. Now, to get camphor balls, the Punan tribe would go up into the mountains, and they had a special dialogue with the deities, and the deities would guide them by means of birds, to the tree. And we know this because in the mid-19th century, the English went to them and said, we want to find out camphor. We needed camphor for military reasons. You put it with gunpowder, it takes away the smoke. So they wanted camphor for military reasons. And so they said, well, we have to go to the Borneo, so far away, So, Joey, go and see what they're up to. So they went this hike up into the mountains, and then the bird said, no, you got to wait here for a little bit. And the bird said, turn left, and the bird said, turn right. And the guy's just going nuts. He said, I can see the damn tree, And finally they get to the tree, and they say, no, that's not a good tree. And they get to another tree, and finally say, that's a good tree. And the guy was so frustrated, he took the axe and he chopped down the camphor tree and discovered that there was just goo on the inside and not camphor balls. You want camphor balls because how are you going to transport the goo? Right? You've got to be hardened things. But these guys knew which tree to cut down. The tree is like a 300-year-old tree. You're not going to just chop down trees willy-nilly, because you chop it down, that's the end of story for that tree, right? But the Punan were making, that's why it's called affluence, right? They were like forest millionaires by understanding you chop down one tree, we're going to be really at the top of the social pecking order. So the way in which the camphor was then brought down to the docks and then to the ships and then unloaded and separated all became very elaborate. The Chinese were the primary buyers of camphor mostly because of medicinal and aphrodisiacal ways until sort of the English came. But the tree was not a tree. It was a living spirit. In other words, you can't just chop down trees, right? You have to ask permission for the tree to say, yeah, I can. A little bit like in Japan when you have to ask down permission to cut down trees when you build the Ise shrine. So, and so here we can sort of see here from these inventory lists, 1,000 pounds of ambergris, agarwood, and camphor. 1,000, that's a lot. That's like a lot of stuff, a lot of inventory. And once again, it wasn't just there because the guy wanted to always smell good, right? These things were put into boxes and packaged as part of marriage arrangements, as part of political alliances. Let's make an alliance. Here's a couple boxes of camphor, right, to show that you're now part of this sort of networky thing, right? So you're not giving gig silk, right? So once again, that's why they call it the maritime silk route is like a little weird, right? Because they're giving maybe some silk too, but the real imprint tool, right, of Islam is these commodities that come from far upstream. So Borneo is particularly important because in this story because it has a lot of these types of commodities. So I just happened to type in there Borneo, what AI says. For most of the last one I named, Borneo remained isolated from the rest of the world. This is complete bullshit. This is like really the danger of AI, right, is that it sort of takes out received 19th century ideas and sort of produces them as if that's the real thing, right? Borneo was not disconnected from the world, right? The Punan tribe had vests that they wore that were filled with Chinese buttons and so forth and so on. So this is the geographic issue that I'm facing with, trying to describe this. Now, when I first started teaching, John Abu Lagad's book came out in 1989. It was very influential for me personally, probably much more than Said's book. And it was like, oh my God, finally I see someone, opening up getting us out of the Eurocentric worldview. And it was like, it changed my teaching and everything and thinking a lot. But then when I started writing this book, I said, okay, let me see what Janet has to say about it, right? And I was sort of shocked to realize she never opens the box. She just says trade. Trade this, trade that. Lesser importance, this and this. The did not generate trade. The state of order of the Gulf, fragment of control, protection, this and this. Alternative trade routes, unification of Iraq, encourages trade. She never looks into the box, right? Into the crates. What is being traded? Not once. It's just all very abstract. So that gets me worried because I'm trying to say you got to open up the box and look, and that really matters. Or you get some general thing like, a variety of trade goods were exchanged, right? Just lots and lots of stuff were flowing this way, flowing that way, flowing whatever way, right? Well, that's fine. It's probably a little bit better. But once again, the specificity of this is really important to understand how these economies work. And it's not just saying, there were just piles of them. Right. So what we get in some bad diagram here is this sort of dark matter economy, where as the further upstream you go, the more invisible all of this becomes, right? And so the word trade is increasingly problematic, even as a concept, right? Trade history will get us sort of like this far, but is what we're dealing with up here trade, right? Yeah, it belongs in the small t idea that's trade, but it has its own economic force and engine to it. So to get back, put the train back on the track, they arrived at camphor. So camphor, the word camphor comes from Camphor Barus, which is that town up in the northern part of the island, which is called Barus. Camphor means powder, so it's the powder from Barus. So the traders didn't even know that it came from Borneo. They thought it came from Camphor Barus, right? Because that's where they stopped and got the camphor, right? Only like in the 12th century did they realize, oh, thank you, the Javanese for, bringing it up, right? So the Javanese were trying to spice up the system by making the camphor closer to where the traders were going, right? So they didn't have to go to Borneo, right, which would be 1,000 miles out. Now, what did the Borneo people write? You can't arrive at Borneo and say, give me your gold. You have to know what they want, right? Well, what they wanted, more than anything, was beads. So the famous Borneo beads of Borneo, very famous, people have studied them, lots and lots of books on it. None of these beads are made in Borneo. None, zero. They're all imported. And the beads were very, very valuable, and different cultures, different tribes, different villages had specific different bead colors that they wanted to represent them. And so they would tell the traders, no, I need purple, blue, and orange. And I need it to have it swirling, like that. And so they would go back to India or to China, and they would tell the guy, bead maker, I need purple, blue, and orange, swirly type, and just give me a bucket full, And so the Borneo cultures would put in specific beads for specific designations, for men and women, for old and young, for powerful and not powerful, and so forth and so on. So they weren't idiots. They knew they couldn't do beads, but they wanted really, particular beads, right? Well, so the guys in India at first, and then later in China, well, they weren't idiots either. They're going, beads? Oh, thank God you want beads. Beads are like really cheap to make. So all over India we see bead manufacturing beginning to take place. And, we know also, the reason we know a lot about it, because these bead manufacturings were well into the 19th century. And so we have some evidence of how they worked and how the orders came in and so forth like that. So then you got to get the beads, to Borneo. Well, how do you do that? Well, what they did was they went and got these things called martaban jars. So these are jars, big jars. They're like on a container ship. You have these boxes today. These things are very robust. When the big boats go like this, the martaban jars they're pretty solid things, right? So you fill them with whatever you want, right? And then you put them with wax on top, and you seal them, and you're good to go, right? You can put food into it. You fill them with beads. Right? And so here we see this is on the Irrawaddy River. Still today, they're using them. Obviously, historical documents sort of show them. The guys in Borneo wanted these jars. They didn't know or care that they came from China or from India. They saw these jars as magic, and they were going, well, we know we can't make the jars, and these jars are magical, and here are these people bringing these jars to us. It's like we're making the better deal, right? So for the Borneo people, they thought they were winning the deal, right? Now it turns out in Borneo, every longhouse, which is how the Punam people lived, had a jar in its center part. It was not a longhouse without a jar. The jar was this ancestral location where the ancestors literally lived. So you didn't have this building without the jar. So you can sort of see them lined up here in this shrine. The jars were oracular. The older, the better. The older ones would speak to you, say things. You could ask it questions. And they particularly liked jars that had dragons on them and things like that, right? So the Chinese made dragons and put them on them and things like that. The jars are made in China or in Indonesia and various parts are like nothing. They cost nothing to make this. This is not high caliber porcelain ware, right? Really thick stuff, right? Right. This isn't teacups, right? But so now here's a visitor. There's the Punan don't exist anymore. It's a long, terrible, tragic story. I don't even want to get into it. It may just make me want to cry. But there's a museum off one of their houses, and this is guys wandering around. And he comes upon the shrine. You see the jar, musical instruments. And you can sort of see the jar there. Okay. So he doesn't understand what he's looking at, right? The jar, like the gongs, is a speaking thing. It's an instrument of communicating with the ancestors, right? It's the fundamental part of that ancestral shrine. The gongs is the entertainment part, right? So they arrive, the boats, with their jars filled with beads, and the guys in the Punan are like going, that's right, we're done, right? You can have all the gold you want, right? But they're going to have to go up to Vietnam, they're going to have to go up to China, and so they have to think ahead. Well, what do the Chinese want when we get to China, right? So we know what the guys in Indrapura want, but we know you can't arrive with an empty ship in China. That's ridiculous, right? So we need to have stuff. So what do the Chinese want, right? Well, the Chinese wanted more than anything bird's nest soup. Anybody had this? I see a few nods. Right now, the birds, the sparrows or whatever, I think there's type of sparrows, they make their spit and they put it up in the cave and they make their nest. Basically protein, completely tasteless. But in China, bird's nest soup is like really, still today, pretty expensive, right? Here's a video on how to make it and all that type of stuff. I'm not going to show you with it. And relatively up until about 20 years or so, this was, one of the premier places to get the bird's nest soup. So here's this guy, Mr. Sahat, who is now retired. Very dangerous. Really, 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 really dangerous. You got to know what you're doing, right? And here too, there's sort of rituals that go along with this, right? You can't just take all the bird's nests, right? Because then the birds don't have babies, right? So you can only take a certain percentage of the birds, right? Of the nest, right? So that they don't notice, so to speak, right? Otherwise, that's the end of story, right? So they know exactly the routines of the birds and the comings and goings and how all that works, and they bring it down. But they don't like bird's nest soup. Borneo, they're just ridiculous, right? So, but apart from this harvesting, which is really dangerous, right? They don't have to do anything, right? They don't have to grow anything. They don't have to cut anything. They don't have to grind anything. They don't have to harvest anything, really. They just have to sort of scrape it off the top of the caves. So, of course, they bring all of this to Boris, right, in order to simplify the trade acquisition. So, okay. So when they get to China, what else do the Chinese want? Well, one of the things the Chinese wanted, and they loved more than ever, and this is in their records, is pearls from Sri Lanka. So they thought pearls in Sri Lanka were the best pearls in the world. There were other pearls, obviously. And on the west bank there, you see these called the pearl banks. To get the pearl, you just dive down and get the pearls. But there's sharks in the water, and we know from oral histories that you had to do this sort of magical bowl, and then the type of ritual shaman lady would shoo the sharks away so that the pearl divers could go there without getting eaten. So a lot of, once again, an epistemological know-how goes to getting the pearls. You can't just sort of dive down and get them. So the Chinese also wanted sulfur. So we can pass my piece of sulfur around. Obviously, they wanted to make gunpowder. Where are they going to get the sulfur? Well, the Chinese don't have sulfur. They had to import it, right? So they had to get it. So where do they get that from? Well, they got it from a place called Laku, which means gunpowder, which means sort of sulfur or gunpowder in Chinese. but it's Sumatra, which is the world today, and it comes from this mountain, Mount Ijen, which is right down here where Borobudur is and where all the gold is coming in and where all the camphor is coming in. So if you're in this territory here, you're just sitting in heaven, right? You just send some young guys to get the sulfur, right? It's, of course, incredibly dangerous, but yeah, they're young, you pay them well with some feast or something, right? And so it's felt this comes from that mountain, right? And
this is how it's the super hot you have to cool with.
So you have to know how it works and how to get it. I mean, it's once again an epistemological thing. So you go to Sri Lanka to get the pearls and you get the cinnamon. It's a special cinnamon only from Sri Lanka. Cinnamon verum, not this stuff that you get in Stop and Shop, which comes from probably Indonesia. It's not really cinnamon, it's fake cinnamon. Then you got to go to Samudra to get the sulfur. You go to Indrapura to deliver the gold, and so maybe some ritual specialist you drop off, and you get the agarwood and the musk. Then you go on to China with the pearls, the sulfur, the bird's nest, and the cinnamon. And then you get the bees in the jars. Then you go back to Baras, deliver the bees, and get the camphor. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not a line, right? I'm not saying that they did this either, right? But we don't really know. One guy did this, another guy did that, and another guy did this, and so forth like that, right? But it was really a complicated sort of geography. So then comes the ambergris. I'm going to give me just a few more minutes to just throw in the ambergris. These guys, this whale shit right here in Morocco with the guy I bought the ambergris from, right? And still today, it's very great. If you wander around somewhere in the Indian Ocean and you find one, you make a heap of money. So the ambergris comes from the Maldives. We know that from some records from the Arab traders, which say that, we got the ambergris when we went to the Maldives. We also know it from various Arab accounts, but we also know it from later Portuguese accounts. So this was, you could have gotten it at various places. I mean, it was African and so forth, but Maldives was the special place for it. So you show up to Maldives, what do they want? You can't just show up with an empty ship, right? So you've got to know, what do the guys in Maldives want? The Maldives, more than anything, wanted rice. You cannot grow anything in Maldives. It's sand. They couldn't grow rice and corn or cotton, whatever it is. So they were going, okay, bring us some rice, right? And by the way, we're going to take that rice and we're going to make it into this great festival, right? So if you don't show up with rice, don't show up, right? So in September, they have this incredible rice cooking thing where the boats are arriving with tons and tons of this rice on the beach, right? And they put the rice in, and everybody cooks rice, and they give you rice, and you got to give me rice, and I got to give you rice. It's like insane, man. I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, okay, I'm done with the rice business, right? But they sort of celebrate this sort of weird thing where they have a whole island where you can't grow rice, and it's all imported, right? So they say, okay, here's your ambergris for that, right? So in other words, there's a clear quid pro quo. Now, the other thing that they have are cowrie shells. And I could ask you, which one comes from the Maldives? I'm really tricky about this. But cowrie shells are a very peculiar type of device. They're used throughout Southeast Asia well into the early 19th century, especially in the mountains and the hills and so forth. Until the English, the colonialists put a kibosh on that. These are the same value. This one comes from the Philippines. It's very beautiful and it's huge, and you will go, I'd like to have this one. But it's the same value as this one from the Maldives. So if I'm a trader, why would I want a bag of this when I can get 10 times as more in my bag, the tiny ones? So the Maldive cowrie shells were tiny and exquisite, and the traders obviously, were thinking of weight, right? And so a bag will only hold so much. This is like, maybe 10 of these, right, for one of those, right? So to hell with the ones from the Philippines, right? So the people came and they just scooped up these things. Now, of course, they didn't scoop them up themselves. The Maldivians would send the women on the moonlit nights. There were special palm fronds that these creatures would suck up on. They had to know how to get them out of the water, right? And then get them and then, dehusk them, so to speak, and then dry them and so forth like that. So another incredible epistemological thing was at play. So these guys arrive with rice, right? That's all pretty much they wanted, and cinnamon, some cinnamon, because if you go to the Maldives today, rice and cinnamon patties is what people are making. So there's the cinnamon. Where does this come from? Oh, it comes from Sri Lanka. So that means before they go to the Maldives, they got to go to Sri Lanka. Well, okay, Sri Lanka had rice and cinnamon, had some rubies there, which I'm going to just leave out for the sake of some sort of simplicity. So what you're sort of seeing here is almost a non-ending linkage of sort of like this has to come before that, and this has to come before that, and this has to come before that, and this has to come before that. And so the guys in Sri Lanka, they made rice like the wazoo because they knew everybody's here for rice to go to the Maldives. And everybody went to the Maldives to get those shells because they needed the shells to pay for this and pay for that. Right? So it was an incredible sort of exchange economy, and in which rice is the heaviest element so far that we've talked about. Right? These guys, a bag of this, $1 million. Right? So, I mean, I'm, just exaggerating a little bit, but I'm saying this is like, wealth of a particular type. A bag of rice, okay, that's when it's starting getting a little bit heavy, and it needs to be industrialized and so forth. So I'm going to get to the map. Here. Right. So we see it's sort of getting complicated, right? For all of this to work, right? And what do the guys then? It keeps on going. Like, what do the guys in Sri Lanka want? Well, they wanted camphor just like everybody else, but they built the building, so they became very wealthy in 200 roughly, so 100 BC. They were distributing all this stuff out, and they said, we're going to make the biggest stupa in the world. Why not? We're Buddhists, we're going to make the big stupa. So they made, at that time, the biggest building in the world, which is the stupa. It's never featured in any architectural history classes because, well, it's stupa and there are thousands and thousands of them. How can you tell the difference, right? But this was built as a landmark. This was built as Frank Gehry type of Bilbao effect, right? We want a building that's so grand, so amazing that people are going to be talking about this and want to come here. But it's a stupa. It's really not that interesting, right, as architecture. Well, fortunately for us, they left some records, and they'd be completely dismissed by historians because they're seen as exaggerations. And they describe how they made the foundations of the stupa. Well, in my reconstruction of it, we had stones, we had Himalayan clay, quartz, iron, white stones, rock crystal, stones, wood, apple, mercury, resin, bronze, and silver, all lined up in the foundations, completely invisible. Well, they're Buddhist, right? They're not trying to show off, right? But down there, it's like really amazing $1 million worth of quicksilver, take it from me, type of thing. And all of these had magical properties, of course, right? So it wasn't just for nothing, right? They were doing this, right? They were showing off the magical healing processes of the building. The building is a healing machine, right? Quartz, right? And all these things were part of sort of the radiation of healing that would come out of this building. And, well, all that had to come from somewhere. Now, if I'm an Arab trader, well, I got to get the quartz, right? Well, where does the quartz come from? And where's the cinnabar come from? Well, the cinnabar only came from 2 places in the world at that time. One was Spain. Oh, well, these guys were from Spain. So when they're leaving Spain, they're going, oh, my God, we got to go to Sri Lanka. I bet you they want that cinnabar. Let's stock up. So their probably boat is leaving with cinnabar, and this is probably the first part of the equation, right? Then they get to here, they drop off the cinnabar to get the rice and the cinnamon. Then they go to the Maldives, they get the cowrie shells, right, and the ambergris, and then the next guy goes to the next link, and so forth and so on. And so you can begin to see this incredible interpenetrating of wealth throughout the whole system. So this is just a fantasy, but I'm just sort of saying you got to sort of imagine the fiction of going, dropping, going, this, exchanging that, you know. At the end of all of this, right, you have the box, but this box carries that story sort of within it. And it's like a clockwork, it's like a biological system, right? You can't just take the musk and just talk about musk, right? It's like taking the lungs and not talking about the thorax, right? Or taking the heart and not talking about the liver, right? I mean, it's almost like biologically intertwined, right? And you can't just sort of, you know, and it's also balanced, you know, if you start, someone comes with too much cowrie shells, their value goes down. So you have to understand the value relationships of all of this stuff. And so what I'm asking to do in the book is think of a transdisciplinary geographic anthropology of interdependency. So how are these worlds interdependent? And think of anthropology of interdependency, which goes against some of the traditional, not necessarily the more recent idea of anthropology, traditional idea of anthropology, which is sort of people-centric, then you got your religions, and then economy is sort of the last thing you really talk about. But this interdependency is what I'm sort of seeing in all this, right? And is sort of a sweet spot of energy that happens. And what we have is cross-geographical, is cross-linguistic, is cross-ecological, is cross-cultural, cross-polity type, cross-delivery expertise, and even cross-religions, if you think of the Islamic part, which sort of masters some of it, but actually masters it more by sucking it in rather than actually doing it, right? The Islamic traders never went past the ports, right? They got to the port and they made this trade and so forth, but everything in the hinterland, they didn't do that. They stayed at the ports, right? So that's part of the problem also of describing this history, is that the Islamic traders will tell you what's at the port. But when it comes like, well, how did that stuff get here? Like, they don't know, right? So part of the understanding how some things are valuable, but some things are not valuable, because I'm interested in precisely what happens not in the port. So the historiographic issues just sort of pile up, and even, articles like Spices, Scents, and Catalysts, it's really good, but it's a linear history, starting with the beginning of trade, ending with capitalism, right? This book is really brilliant, by Anya King, and I used it and stole some of her footnotes and sources and so forth like that from it. But you see, it's musk in China, musk in India, musk in Tibet, musk in Central Asia. You cannot take musk out of ambergris. You cannot take it out of the box, right, and look at it alone, right? You have to look at these interpenetrated realities, right? It's the musk, the agarwood, and the camphor are together. And that's only the tip of an iceberg of relationships, right? So that's, the story that I was trying to tell is like there are no lines. I'm not putting lines anymore. I'm just sort of diagram forces, or force fields, if you will, right, in order to get this going. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. Okay.
You want to take questions?
Well, questions, of course, if there's... Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mark. This was really fascinating. This is microphone. Okay. Thank you so much. Fascinating. I think this story of what happens beyond the coast is always sort of a black hole. So I really appreciate this explication, this sort of modeling of what that might look like. And I wondered, you talked about Janet Abu-Lughod and her model and how she's getting at some of the processes that you're interested in, but not quite fully explicating what it is that's being traded, and how that question is really the most important one when we're trying to understand precisely how these systems worked. Yeah. I wondered what other sort of models of trade, of commerce, either for this period or just sort of influential ones, historiographically, you have found either useful or that you've sort of been working against. And I have some thoughts about things that sort of may be interesting, some recent sort of models that I've just encountered.
I'd love to hear.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear also just where you sort of see this situated, because there's so many things that came to mind for me, but of course, a lot of the scholarship I'm working on is naturally looking at the European world and European Atlantic world. So, yeah, just sort of curious what's been brought to bear in this geography. Yeah.
Well, this geography is a whole separate, obviously, lecture in a way.
Yes.
Right, to do that. Because it lays bare many of these symptoms, if you will, of how we understand trade that came out of the basically 19th, in fact, early modern ideas of trade. No one denies trade networks existed. That's not, what I'm not saying this is the idea of trade network didn't exist. Anthropologists in the last 15 or 20 years have been looking at a lot at upstream, downstream relationships. So those are the people I'm interested in, right? Generally speaking, I'm speaking very generally, right? The people who work on upstream, downstream relations are very narrow geographies. So there's someone who works on Borneo, right? But never been to Sumatra, never been to India, right? I mean, it's just like, oh, we know how the jars got up there, right? And we know how the gold got down, right? But would never think of putting it into sort of larger environments of exchange, right? Because the anthropological anxiety about, localized anthropological knowledge, right, which is still very strong, right? So you wind up, and then if you do anything that's like comparative, people get very nervous because then they say, oh, you're universal, there's some sort of universal paradigm or something like that. So over the critique of Eurocentrism has in fact made many anthropologists ever more narrower because anything that's bigger, that's outside their orbit, right? Oh, that's another expertise problem, right? And this is very frustrating because you see these patterns, and I was trying to sort of argue that these patterns are important not just for economic persons, but because they impact the architecture that's coming out of these places, right? And as an architect showing, I want to be able to tell this story, but like, why there?
Yeah.
Why is my son there, right? And not somewhere else, Well, I can tell that story, right? Why is Borobudur there and not next door, next valley? You can begin to be much very specific because you see these trade flows are not arbitrary. They come from particular places. They have particular energy field sort of sites, right? So the historiography, I think, is emerging and evolving. There are a bunch of people, like in the footnotes that I talk about, as my friendlies in a way, right? But a large part of it is still like not helpful, right? And Janet Abdelagad, as wonderful it is like zero not helpful, right? Because as soon as you get into abstractions, trade is just trade, right? And I'm trying to say there's a different trade mechanism in dark net economy that you just miss when you just say trade, right? And it's a crying shame because we're missing the fun of as historians, which is to get into the weeds of all this, right, and try to make sense of this stuff rather than make pronouncements from above.
Thank you.
I don't know if somebody. I had a question, but no, go ahead.
No, give it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So fascinating. So we started with a map which looked rather clean and everything is organized. We understand everything, and we end up with this, which is different line weights, circles, different types of colors, etc. And also your talk, sort of going from the box back to somewhere, coming back to the box, was also quite non-linear. And so, as somebody who does this, and you wrote that book, where do you get into dead ends with respect to writing histories? Like, is it causality that we cannot go with, or path tracing that this leads to that because it's not linear? And probably in the very construction of language, one fails, which you break at this talk. You go back and forth, right. Almost like a film that plays with time, like cinematography. So on that historiographical and epistemological struggle, if you can elaborate a bit, because then you really have to break out of all of that.
Well, the historiographical methodological problem, right, is like everywhere, right? in his book. And after I, in fact, wrote it, I said I can't publish it because, I mean, I'm not really an expert in economy. I'm not an economic historian, right? And so I just let it sit there for a while. And then finally, over COVID, I figured it didn't have nothing to do. So I figured, okay, I'll give it to the press and they like it. And they loved it. So I was stuck. You know, I was hoping I would get a rejection. But it gave me some confidence that, you know, that we need to think a little bit more looser when we construct these things. So, you know, I'm not spinning the narrative of the agarwood out of nothing. You know, it's the right narrative, right? How it actually worked on the day-to-day level, no one knows, right? So you have to have some faith in the abstraction, right, to know that the agarwood is over here in Cambodia, Indrapura is there, that's the closest port. Chances are it went there, right? And still today, agarwood from Vietnam is the most expensive, right? So it doesn't take too hard to put the pieces together, but then it does take some confidence to say, oh, that's how they earned their affluence, you know, because now you're speaking with a determined voice. And so that's the risk, right? There's someone could say, no, they brought it down to over there, you know, which they may have done too, right? I mean, you know, but we know from, you know, some traders from the 9th century, 10th century Islamic traders, because they were actually started to document some things, that they got somewhat, so at least one of them got agarwood in Indrapura. So, okay. So we know that it's all possible. It's not complete historical fiction, right? But the point is that the point I'm trying to make is that even if one is more known and less known, the point is that that they're together. The agarwood and the musk and the gold and the this, it's the system. The network is not aligned this way. The networks are flow diagrams of commodities of different valences. Most of them, which I didn't really talk about them, are very lightweight. So they needed like no infrastructure. This was very typical throughout Southeast Asia that these were lightweight luxury items, right? And so this had a big problem later when modernity shows up, you know, and people are barefoot and look like they're poverty-struck, you know, and don't realize that the guys in Borneo were like, you know, connected, right?
Excuse me. Oh, I can be at the end. Thank you, Mark, for the amazing speech. And I definitely agree with Fahad's comment that this is a non-linear narrative. And my question is, I feel like it's also multi-perspectival. And in your research, have you encountered any instances where the narration that came from different sides of the story that contradict one another, or they just tell different sides of the same story? And how do you reconcile these different narratives to form a global perspective? Thank you.
Well, it's a little bit like, you know, sleuthing, you know, like a murder mystery, in a way. It's sort of a mystery because at the end, I want to be able to say I solved the mystery, right? Because, you know, it's not completely open-ended, right? But I want to be able to solve the mystery by acknowledging that the ambiguity plays a big part in it, right? As opposed to just pretending it doesn't play a big part of it, right? So to say, well, we have no evidence of how the Champa negotiated with the guys making the agarwood when it comes to feasts. Like zero. I mean, there's no archaeological evidence, right? There's some like late 19th century oral histories of these guys having feasts, you know, on the first of something or other like that, you know. And we know from other mountain cultures, right, that they had these feasts, you know, but they were maybe in Laos or somewhere else, right? So the people who work on upstream trade, you know, which has actually in the last maybe 10 or 15 years matured quite significantly, right? Or struggle with this, right? But what I'm trying to do here is to point this out as not a methodological hindrance, but as just a part of the way you have to speak to it. You have to address the absence. and accept the fact that we have to construct over that absence, but not eliminate it, right? So like Swiss cheese, right? You can definitely have Swiss cheese, but you know there are the holes, and you see them, and that's a little bit, like that. So it comes to where, in a way, what tells a better story, I must say, because, some of it, I was trying to figure out, the Borneo camphor story. There's another element with the Borneo diamonds, which I didn't talk about, right? And some of it, is very tainted by 19th century colonial perspectives, right? So, like the Borneo headhunters, you read that and you would say colonial perspective, blah, 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 it's illegible, right? I can't do that. But if you read closely, you see his astonishment that these guys walking around in rags, have all this gold in them, right, that they don't want, and they're selling it, right? And you go, okay, that's sort of evidence. Now, can I go back 1,000 years and say that was the situation? No, I have to be careful, right? You can't just retrofit it. But we know that the Indians, traders, around 180, more around 300 or 480, went to Borneo to get gold. So that's, we see the other side of that story, right? And the reason they did that was because the Indians got gold from the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire collapsed around 200, 300. The gold that was brought from Rome to India disappeared. And in India, you can't go to the temple without gold, so you have to have gold from somewhere. So they have to go, 5,000 miles now on their own before the gold was brought to them by the Greek shippers. So they had to figure out how to make the boats, how to make the sails. They couldn't get through the Malacca Pass. It took them 200 years to figure out how to get the sail to the Malacca Pass. They go to Borneo. It turns out to be a disaster. The Borneo and the Indian didn't work out, and so they went to Java. Java said, "We'll do this, right? And we'll give it to you. You just have to get up to Baros, right?" And so the Javanese come on board, right? So these economic histories in their big scale are relatively well known, right? But Clifford Geertz, who's worked on Borneo, worked on Southeast Asia, completely ignores Borneo because the Islamic traders didn't go to Borneo. They didn't need to. The Javanese did all the hard work, right? So all of a sudden, that's another of these Swiss cheese moments where you got to go, oh, no, this story is not over, So, yeah, it's my best guess.
We're running out of time, so I'm going to accommodate only those who have raised their hands and myself. So, 1, 2, 3.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your really exhilarating talk. I was perhaps my question is a silly one, but I just wonder about wind. For example, monsoon wind within the context of the East Indian Ocean, and how shipwreck was such a challenge, sort of to maneuver this kind of terrain. So I just wonder about wind and the acceleration that the monsoon wind might have provided within the East Indian Ocean, and how that might have also accelerated. And I just also wonder, because I'm just so curious, is this meaning that, like, for example, I'm reading Sebastian Pranga's Monsoon Islam, so I just wonder, are you also saying that this monsoonified world or this monsoon Indian Ocean is also an oversimplification of
yes,
this guy?
Yes, okay, I'm going to answer. Okay. That's right. We're obsessed with the monsoons.
Yes.
As we should be. Mm-hmm. Monsoons are these winds go, and the monsoons would go this. But what I'm not showing my slide here, which for the sake of shortness here, but in the book I talk about it. These commodities were not available just whenever.
Right.
Right. The pearls are harvested during the summer. So if you arrive too early, you're not going to get the good pearls. You want to arrive at the moment when you have a lot of pearls to choose from to get the good ones. If you arrive too late, the good ones are gone. Mm-hmm. So you have to arrive in Sri Lanka around August, mm-hmm. when you're just getting a lot of pearls are coming, but they're still like good ones, right? Cinnamon, right, is best time to get to Sri Lanka is in spring. So there are a bunch of temporalities associated with all of this stuff, right? So it's not just the winds blowing, but there's a whole clockwork of, you have to be in Sri Lanka at this time and not at that time. You have to be at Barros at this time and not at that time, right? So you have the winds and these sort of commodity clocks, right, that are really important, because the pearl guys don't want to have big warehouses filled with pearls, right? They get the pearls, they're getting rid of them, right? So you want to be there when they're doing that. If you come in December, there's no pearls left, right? You're gonna have to wait. They don't want to do that, right? The same thing with camphor, right? To get the camphor before colonial period, because when the English came, they had talked to the Punan, and we know a little bit about that, right? You had to land, and then you had to have a feast with them in the longhouse, and you had to do the dancing and the singing, and of course the English are very like, well, I'm not doing any dancing, those stupid barbarians, savages. But you had to do all that, right? And then they would go out, and it would take 2-3 weeks to come back, right? And meanwhile, the traders are in the longhouse, suffering the indignity, right, of living with these savages. And that had its own clock, right? And so all these commodities had very specific clocks. And as far as I know, no one has ever really talked about that. So yes, the monsoons are the big energizers of all this, but underneath the monsoon are smaller clocks, right, that are really important, because that's when I try to talk about this as an organic system, right? The system, you go here and you go there, right? It's interconnected in a way you can't just take one thing out, right? And part of what happens in there, I don't talk about why it all ended, the demise of this, but you can sort of see it's also fragile, right? One year, there are not, let's say, no pearls for whatever reason, Oh my God, that has important ricochets across the whole thing, right? So it's the system understands the balance. So many pearls, so many cowries, so many this, so many that for it to work well. But obviously, so many things are happening. It's not going to work always well, right? There's always this anxiety and stress through the whole system, right? But basically, it worked really well, through this Islamic period, astonishingly well, until it fell apart for any number of reasons around 1200, 1300. So I give Janet Abu Lagat some credit, because that's when she's starting, because she's starting with that sort of moment, right? But therefore, the fun moment, which is this Southeast Asia and Africa also included, right, where the Islamic moment is really sort of, she never looks under the hood to get to the intimacies, of how weather is impacting these exchanges, for example.
Nisha, can you pass this here to another here?
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. It's so great to listen to this talk. Obviously there are specificities of this time period about the global conversation that you have sketched out, the sort of presence of magic to create wealth, and the specific type of transportation and landscapes that we are in. But I cannot help but also be reminded of your project with the Office for Uncertainty Research in Venice, of this house where you look for all the materials that make up the house, which is also part of an ongoing conversation that folks are having right now, thinking of extraction and where all the materials are coming from. So this is a more general question on how your historiographical methodology sort of bounces back and pushes and illuminates your work, the type of work that you do with that office.
I would probably say this is a project where I ask the same question. You have a house, you take it apart. Where does everything come from? Probably we know more about this story than we do about the house. That's a scary thing. We live in an age of information, but what we can tell where things come from in a regular house, is maybe, let's say, like 5% of the story. So much of it is now structurally invisible because of capitalism, because of proprietary copyright issues, and so forth and so on, and because who's going to get us a boat manifest today, right? you could easier get a boat manifest, from an Islamic trader, in the library than you can one today coming from Singapore to Seattle. So the astonishing thing is, we can tell this story a lot better than we can tell the story about our own modern world. I mean, that's sort of the scary, frightening thing about this, But you're right, there's a mythological consistency here, and just like in that story, we celebrated the breadth and reach of the unknown as part of the story, so to get away from the fact that we know the source. Actually, the source is sort of known. That was, probably in Spain, people knew, they came from the Himalayas, So there was often not a lot of mystery about that, right? It's like the mystery was, how did it actually get there, right? And if it required these incredible non-linear, bioeconomical world, right, then we need to think of different models. And I'm not sure if the house exhibitions work, we didn't quite get that far, right? But I was doing these two projects together at the same time.
I would have saved the people the question and the time, but I need the graph that we had of these three silos of the relationship between the tribal, the chieftain, and if you can take us back to it. Yes, here. And this is a question that could develop into a critique, but I need to hear your answer first. Which is, you showed us an extremely complex world of exchange, and I don't know if the word trade applies. And part of the story, again, here you have three silos of different social organizations that are also stratified in our understanding, and one cannot help but see what you're doing here as, in a way, going back to the tripartite division of humanity into sort of like whatever they are. Because you're giving us your state and then sort of like a little bit less political organization and then a sort of like a traditional political organization. So I'm wondering if there is a connection, because also you do not speak about the accumulation of wealth, except in the relationship to the big buildings that were built. But we are left without an understanding of, you presented them as like they wanted this, but was it a fair trade? Because, some people are given things that are so expensive for things that are inexpensive. Are they being tricked into it the same way we think in the colonial age of actually tricking the extraction of raw material versus industrial, the way Christopher Columbus takes the beads to the natives in America, and so on and so forth? Is there a different map, if you want, of where the wealth is being concentrated and how the concentration of wealth is being expressed? You showed us architecture, but there are, of course, other means of accumulation or cumulative economy. And clearly Borneo is not one of them, nor is the Maldives, nor is the Himalaya, even though most of the most precious materials came from these three areas.
Well, we can assume, with our we can say, the beads for gold, right? Who won out on that one, right? But it's less about tricking than about, I don't know the word I'm trying to think, maybe I should have, like cunning, right? From the Indian point of view, making beads for gold, that's a win-win situation, right? The only cost is transportation, right? But for the Borneo people, and we actually have a pretty good knowledge of the Borneo because the English were there trying to get the camphor, and there was a lot of people, adventurers went there, right, and lived with the Punan, right? They're convinced they got the better deal. They do not want the gold. They don't want the diamonds. They don't want any of this stuff. They want jars and beads. So and there's a word that they have, and I can't remember what it is, for the head of the longhouse. It's sort of like a sucking sound. The more powerful you are, the more you can suck out of the environment, right? And you want to literally suck material upstream to you, right? And so the chiefs, right, would have this magical power they would say, these white guys show up with jars, magic jars, and filled with beads. It must be because the chief is so powerful, he sucks them to him, right? He didn't have to go to China. They're bringing it to him. So they saw that as a power, right? I can't remember the exact word for that. And this is very relatively common. I don't want once again a little bit say universal, but it's relatively common, right? That that the chiefs were seen as having these magical powers to attract long distance trade, and people who work on long distance trade, will talk about that. That for them, the trade is centered on their personality, on the personality of the chief or the headman who has a particular trade. But we would just say he's a good tradesman. He knows how to negotiate well. So it does work both. Later, of course, it becomes clear who's winning and who's losing, right? And so now, if you go to them, they know they were suckered out, right? But at this time, everybody is winning, right? The Punan have their brilliant longhouses, and they have all their ancestors nicely stashed away in these big jars. The jars are speaking to them from their corner. They're in good shape. So we have to be careful not to get too far into the colonial, post-colonial anxiety of, that this is some exploitation. That doesn't mean exploitation didn't happen. There was enough exploitation of other sorts. Right.
Your graph here is tying it to political forms, because these three political forms, some of them are much more tightly controlled and controlling. The others are much less so, perhaps more related to kinship and so on.
That's right.
So again, there is a stratification that corresponds to how we see who is winning and who is losing in the trade.
Yeah, I think so too. But maybe what instead of using, that's why these words are in quotation marks, because what is a state, what's a chieftain, what's a tribe, and all that type of stuff. A lot of discussion and conversation about that. But it could be metropole and, non-metropole people, in a way, right? That gets into other types of issues, right? That gets to the mythological question and the anxiety of, well, how do you abstract it? How do you theorize this?
Yeah.
Right. So anthropologists might tell you about how the trade works, but they would never theorize it. So I'm taking the rather difficult step of putting in a diagram, which this is not the diagram in the book, but it's similar to the diagram in the book, that tries to get us to see, that this is highly invisible. We don't know really what's going on inside, these cultures. We know a lot on this side. So there's the asymmetries are continuously at play. So that's the theoretical point with having to use words that are coming from the 19th century mainly. You still have that problem. I don't know, Nasser.
We're over.
Okay.
Thank you.
Come down. All right. Thank you very much. Yeah.